In this video segment, we shall discuss the different ways in which a block cipher can be used or can be operated. Now, what is a block cipher? A block cipher is a symmetric cipher which takes in a block of bits and feeds it to the encryption algorithm and produces the ciphertext which is of same length. The best example happens to be DES. So DES algorithm, encryption algorithm, takes in a 54-bit block of plain text using a 56-bit key and produces a 64-bit block of ciphertext. Now, what are the different ways in which this DES encryption algorithm can be used? So, taking DES as an example, let us see 4 different ways in which DES can be operated. So, these different ways can be applied to different block ciphers too. So, we'll just take DES as an example. The first method happens to be electronic codebook mode. So we have the plain text, which is a long sequence of bits. So essentially, when DES is used as an encryption algorithm to encrypt the entire sequence of bits, this sequence of bits has to be segmented into blocks of 64. So we have the first segment of plain text, each of length 64 bits. Right? So I have the first segment of 64 bits, the second plain text block, the third plain text block, and so on. And I have the nth plain text block of length 64 bits. Right? So I have a long sequence of bits. So if we plan to use DES to encrypt the entire sequence of data, so we have to segment the entire sequence into blocks of 64. So in electronic codebook, what is done is the first segment, plain text, let me call this as PT1, plain text 1, is given to the encryption algorithm, uses the key K to produce the first block of plain text. Right? So this happens in the first time segment. So let me call this as T1. So next, what do? We consider the next block of plain text, PT2, give it to the encryption algorithm, which uses the same key K to produce the next block of ciphertext, CT2, and so on. And then at the nth time segment, TN, we give in the last plain text block of length 64 bits to the encryption algorithm, which uses the same key K to produce the ciphertext CTN. Okay, so this happens during the process of encryption. So decryption, what happens? So I get the entire ciphertext, which is nothing but all these 64 bits appended, right? So then what do? I consider the first block of ciphertext of length 64 bits, give it to the decryption algorithm, which uses the same secret key K, producing PT1. Then in the next time segment, so this is happening at the receiving end. So we give CT2 to the decryption algorithm using the same secret key K to produce PT2, and so on. And then I have the last ciphertext block given to the decryption algorithm producing PTN. So this happens at the decryption. So this happens at the destination. So this is decryption. So this happens at the source, and this is the encryption. Okay. So now what is the drawback here? Now if I have blocks of 64-bit data which is repeating in the plain text. So if I assume that PT1 is equal to PT2 is equal to PT3. So if I have 64 bits of data which repeat in the plain text, what happens? We get the same ciphertext. So if all these three plain text blocks are the same, then I would have CT1 equal to CT2 equal to CT3. So the same 64-bit block of plain text would produce the same ciphertext block if I am using the same key. So this essentially gives the cryptanalyst a possibility to exploit and to predict the plain text. Okay, so these regularities which would get observed in the ciphertext, which appears in the ciphertext, would give the cryptanalyst a chance to predict either the key or to predict either the plain text. Okay, so in order to avoid this, we go in for the next method of using a block cipher, which is known as cipher block chaining mode. Now this cipher block chaining mode is actually used in order to overcome the deficiency of the electronic code book. So what was happening in electronic code book? If we had the same 64-bit block of plain text repeating, we would get the same ciphertext. So this has to be avoided. So what is done is, the sender and receiver, the source and destination, the two users share, apart from the secret key, another 64-bit data which is known as the initialization vector. So what is done is the first plain text block. So again here the entire input is divided into blocks of 64 bits. Right? Blocks of 64 bits. So let me call this as P1, P2 and Pn. Okay, so the first plain text block is initially XORed with the initialization vector. So what is the initialization vector? A 64-bit data which is shared between both the source and destination. So this is of length 64 bits plain text is given to the encryption algorithm, which uses the secret key K, produces the ciphertext C1. So now for the next stage, I have P2. So P2 is XORed with C1, right? So the output of the first stage now acts in place of the initialization vector, is XORed with P2 and then given to the encryption algorithm, uses the key K to produce the next ciphertext block C2, and this continues. And the last plain text block Pn is XORed with the ciphertext block from the previous stage. So this is Cn-1 and then given to the encryption algorithm, which uses the secret key K to produce the ciphertext Cn. So this happens at the source. So this is the process of encryption, which happens at the source. Right? So now what is decryption? Now C1 is given to the decryption algorithm using the key K and produces the intermediate data. Now what is this intermediate data? So this intermediate data, let me call this as P1 dash. So P1 dash is the input to the encryption algorithm. So therefore the output of the decryption algorithm happens to be P1 dash. Okay, so now how do I get back P1? We get back P1 if this data P1 dash is again XORed with the initialization vector. So if the data is XORed, if a given data is XORed with the same data twice, we get P1. So P1 is obtained. Right? So now in the next stage, what happens? C2 is given to the decryption algorithm using the key K. So we would get P2 dash. So what is P2 dash? This is P2 dash, which is nothing but XOR of P2 and C1. So how do I get P2? I need to XOR this P2 dash with C1. Right? So it is XORed with C1 to get P2. Okay? And this continues. And for the last stage, I have Cn. So the decryption algorithm uses the key K and produces the intermediate Pn dash. Okay? So in order to get Pn, I need to XOR this with Cn minus 1 and we get Pn. Okay, so this is known as cipher block chaining mode. So now what happens, even if I have the plain text blocks which are the same or which are repeating. Now if we assume that P1 is equal to P2 is equal to P3, then what happens, I will not get C1 equal to C2 equal to C3. Now why is this so? In the first case, P1 is XORed with the initialization vector. So I get C1. Okay, so C1 is not directly dependent on P1 but is dependent on P1 and IB, right? So now to get C2, we are not directly encrypting P2 but we are encrypting P2 XOR with C1. So I get C2 and so on. So even if blocks of 64 bits repeat in the plain text, I would have different ciphertext blocks because of the process of XOR which happens at the input. Now what is the disadvantage here? The disadvantage is that during the process of transmission, so I have the entire ciphertext which includes all the ciphertext blocks C1, C2, C3, C4 and so on, which is received at the destination end. So let us assume that there is an error in C1. A few bits of C1 are in error. So what happens if C1 is in error, then definitely P1 dash will be in error and therefore P1 is in error. So the error propagates. Now why is this so? Because P2 depends on C1, right? So here C2 is given to the decryption algorithm and I get P2 dash. But how do I get P2? I get P2 by XORing it with C1, but C1 has errors. Okay, so the error propagates here in cipher block chaining mode. So therefore, because of XORing which takes place, we have propagation of error which takes place. Okay, so though we have avoided the problem of having the same ciphertext blocks if the plain text blocks repeat, because of XORing the given data with the cipher block of the previous stage, we have the error propagation. Okay, so if there is an error in one of the ciphertext blocks, then we realize that the error propagates. There would be error in many plain text blocks. So here, in order to provide maximum security, the initialization vector should be protected as well as the key, right? So you have the key which is securely distributed between the two parties who are communicating A and B, and we also need to securely transmit the initialization vector I. The third method is cipher feedback mode. In the previous two techniques, we have seen the various ways in which a block cipher like DES can be implemented in two different ways. But if I want a block cipher, for example DES, which takes in an input of 64 bits at a time, so I do not want to encrypt all 64 bits at a time, but say I want to encrypt 8 bits at a time, or 16 or 32 using DES. So in such a case we use cipher feedback mode or output feedback mode. So what is done in this method? So this method takes a lot of time because at every stage we are either encrypting 8 bits, 16 or 32, and this selection can be made. Now in cipher feedback mode, initially there is a 64-bit register which is stored with a 64-bit initialization vector. right? So as we've already seen, the initialization vector is like a key which is shared between both the users securely. So the initialization vector, the 64 bits, is stored in the register, and this initialization vector, that is the data, is encrypted using DES, using a particular key. So among these 64 bits, only S number of bits are selected. So here we have 64 bits which we obtain, which is encrypted. So what I get here is the encryption of the initialization vector, 64 bits. So among these 64 bits, S number of bits are selected. So S can either be 8 or can be 16 or 32. Right? So if we choose S to be 8, so the 8 leftmost bits are selected and the remaining bits, 64 minus S, are discarded. Okay, so these S bits, so here 8 is now XORed with the 8 bits of the plain text. So if I choose S to be 8, the entire plain text is divided into groups of 8 bits. So here the first block of 8 bits is XOR and we get the ciphertext. So ciphertext is again C1 is 8 because S is equal to 8. So if I choose S to be 16, then in that case we choose 16 bits, which is XORed with 16 bits of the plain text, and the remaining bits, 64 minus 16 bits, are discarded. Okay, and C1 would be 16, of length 16. So this is the first stage. So assuming S to be 8, C1 is of length 8. And what is done for the next stage, since this is a shift register, it is shifted left by S bits, and these 8 bits, that is C1, is placed here, okay, in the LSB position of the shift register. So this is the most significant bit position, this is the least significant bit position. So we shift the register by S positions and C1 is stored here, the leftmost S bits. So again this is given to DES encryption algorithm, which is encrypted using the key K. Again we select 8 bits and then is XORed with the next set of plain text, and then we get C2, and this process continues. Right? So this is known as cipher feedback mode. Now what about the decryption process? Now we need to observe that during the process of decryption we get C1, C2 up and so on up to Cn. Right? So at the destination end, say user B gets all the cipher text C1, C2, C3 and so on up to Cn. They are all of length S bits. So here since S is 8, so this is of length 8, 8, 8 and so on. Now how did we get C1? We got C1 by XORing the S bits, which is the output of the encryption block, with P1. So S XORed with P1 gives me C1. Now during the process of decryption I have C1. So if I XOR this with S, we get P1. So during the process of decryption we use the encryption algorithm itself. So here we have to remember that during the process of decryption also, till here the process remains the same. So till this stage the process remains the same, where in the first stage we have a 64-bit initialization vector or data which is stored in the register, which is encrypted using DES, and then S number of bits are selected. Okay, so now during the process of decryption, these S number of bits is XORed with C1, the received ciphertext C1, to obtain P1. And now C1 is stored in the LSB bit position. So again you are going to shift the register left by S bits. You are going to store C1 here, and till here the process remains the same. So therefore this data, the S bits again is XORed with C2 and we get P2. So again we are going to shift the contents of the register by S bits to the left, and we are going to store C2, and then the process repeats. Okay, so this is known as cipher feedback mode. So one thing which we need to remember is that in cipher feedback mode, both during the process of encryption and in the process of decryption, that is at the destination end, we will only be using the encryption algorithm and not the decryption algorithm. Now the next method is output feedback mode, which is very similar to cipher feedback mode with a few changes. So in output feedback mode, so in cipher feedback mode, what was being stored? In the shift register, C1 was being stored, right? So here in output feedback mode, so let me redraw the diagram for the process of encryption. So this is XORed with P1 and we get C1. So in cipher feedback mode, C1 is stored here. But in output feedback mode, the output of the encryption, so we are selecting these S bits, isn't it? So these S bits are stored in the shift register, right? So let me call this as O1, okay, the output. So the output of the encryption algorithm, so we are selecting S bits. So we shift the contents of the shift register by S bits, and the output here is stored. Okay, so again this is XORed with P2 to get C2, and let me call this data as O2. So O2 is stored here in the next stage. Okay, so this is known as output feedback mode, right? So now what about the process of decryption? In the process of decryption, as I said, the process still here remains the same. Okay, so the process still here remains the same. So therefore we obtain P1 by XORing it with C1, right? So till here I get O1, okay? So O1 XORed with C1 gives me P1. So that's as simple as that. So in the next process I get O2 here, and at the destination stage I need P2, so we XOR it with C2 to get P2, right? So this process is known as output feedback mode. Now why do we replace the contents of the shift register with O1 instead of C1? In cipher feedback mode we were storing C1 here, okay, and C2 and so on in the successive stages. Now during the process of decryption, when the receiver receives the ciphertext, if there are errors in the ciphertext, if C1 is in error, a few bits of C1 is in error, so what happens? C1 is in error, so therefore P1 is in error, and the same C1 is also stored in the shift register. You're going to shift left by S bits and we're going to store C1 here. C1 is in error, so therefore the output what I get is an error, so therefore that is XORed with C2, so therefore P2 also will be in error. So there is error propagation which takes place in cipher feedback mode. In order to avoid this propagation of error, we go in for output feedback mode, right? So if C1 is in error, what happens? I would find that only P1 would be in error, because in the next stage we are placing O1, right? So we are actually placing O1, and this, the encryption of the initialization vector is performed at the destination stage. So therefore there is no error obtained. So O1, O2, O3 will never be in error because it is the output of the encryption, right? So therefore there is no error and there is no error propagation. So if a particular cipher data is in error. Say if C1 is in error, only P1 will be in error. And the error does not propagate to the next stage. So that is the advantage of going in for output feedback mode when compared to cipher feedback mode. So these are some of the ways in which a block cipher can be implemented. So we have seen 4 different ways. So depending on the requirement and need, we can choose any one of these 4 methods.